There's a few words that's already started to emerge. I'm sure my colleagues have heard it, and like teamwork, and the main one is collaboration, which seems to be coming out loud and clear just about the nature of the environment we find ourselves in for looking at science in Scotland. And my next question is, so what are the opportunities available for scientists in Scotland to develop their work and ensure their work has the most world impact? Is it this collaboration that you're talking about? I'll come to you, Professor Boswell, with that one.
So I think there are absolutely opportunities, and we're seizing those opportunities across a number of areas, whether it's through collaboration, industry engagement, other areas of innovation. So I think a number of universities in Scotland have really ramped up their industry engagement and commercialisation activities, for example, and that's been hugely beneficial. But I do think let's grasp the nettle here. There is a funding challenge. Considerable funding challenge. Only about 83% of our research is actually funded through the dual funding system, which is the core grant and grant funding. And that means that we have to cross-subsidise research through other means, and mainly through international student income. And as you know, that challenge is particularly pronounced in Scotland because of the differential in the income we get from students. And there are a number of other impediments and ways in which perhaps it's not a level playing field with the rest of England. So absolutely fantastic opportunities, but some real challenges over funding, which I hope we can unpack a bit in this session.
We are most definitely going to do that. I'm going to stick just now on some of the background, and I'm going to come to you, Dr. High, and all this. It's just what opportunities and what do Scottish scientists need in order to ensure that their work is taken to this new world audience?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we are encountering is a challenge where a lot of funding opportunities come with a very short, compressed time horizon. So there will be calls, and this will be coming from UKRI, for example, so it's UK-wide funding. We will have a call, we build our teams, we put in applications, and we're being asked to deliver very, very soon after we are being told if we are lucky to win the awards. And that very compressed time horizon, I think, affects our ability to deliver. So for scientists, if it was possible to have a slightly longer time horizon, we would be able to deliver so much more on the pound.
The funding issues come up a couple of times now, so I'm going to address this directly, because we asked for evidence. We've got loads of evidence. We're very grateful to everybody who's submitted what has been really, really helpful stuff to this inquiry. But funding, of course, is one of the key things that we've dealt with. And I don't know about colleagues around the rest of the committee, but I've looked at some of the funding arrangements, the infrastructure for support and resourcing. It's Byzantine. It's really, really difficult to understand about who gets what, how that's done, what works with what. I mean, you mentioned some of the devolution aspects of all this and the comparisons with the rest of the UK. Just give me your views about like the funding infrastructure and environment that you work on. And don't go into in depth because we're going to come to them specifically, but just generally, what do you feel about where you are? And Professor Boswell, you brought it up first, so perhaps you could help us with that.
Yeah, that's right. So I think one of the issues is the disparities, and I mentioned the cross-subsidisation challenge, but there's also the challenge that there are a number of pockets of funding which we simply don't have access to in Scotland. One of those is a sort of much more substantial innovation funding in England as compared to Scotland. So just to use the example I'm most familiar with, Edinburgh University would be receiving £5 million a year if it were based in England for innovation, whereas it receives 1.7 million being based in Scotland. Similar disparity around some of the funding for biomedical research, where the NIHR in England quite generously funds biomedical research centres not available in Scotland. Again, a university on the scale of Edinburgh or Glasgow is probably missing around 25 million a year. So these are huge disparities, and the problem is this doesn't just affect our core research funding, it also affects our ability to leverage external funding. So in the absence of core funding, we're less competitive for UKRI grants, and we have less capacity to build the infrastructure to support commercialisation and industry engagement. And we also, and this is the risk coming up on the horizon, we may well be less competitive in the next REF, the next Research Excellence Framework, because we haven't received the same kind of funding for research culture, but also the same level of core grants. So I think there's a real risk of a downward spiral and a real threat to this position, this status, and again this powerhouse of Scottish higher education research in Scotland, that we might be in risk of having that eroded.
And is that the experience of your colleagues who are sitting to your left? Is Professor Gill?
If I could come in terms of the institutes in Scotland, because Scotland also has a history of endowments from various people in terms of setting up institutes, particularly in agriculture, which is my background area. And over the years, there has been a move from those being funded. At one point, they were funded within government, and now they've been sort of moved further out from government. And so they don't get the dual funding system that universities actually get, but they only get the 80% funding, which UKRI actually gives. And they also have trouble in terms of accessing some of the funding for infrastructure. And that, again, I think they are a very important part, the institutes, of the Scottish research landscape. And so they're even more challenged, I think, in terms of some of those funding limits, trying to keep a smallish, like keeping a small business going without having access to all the funding sources.
We want to capture that, hear more about some of these specific and distinct issues, but I'm just generally interested just now in the funding infrastructure, the place where we find ourselves. We've not heard from you, Professor Fitzpatrick, just your observations about how you operate, and is it roughly the same experience as Professor Boswell?
Yes, really, from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, we would agree very much with that. The sustained real term cuts in public funding since about 2014 and 15, and that has caused a disproportionate reliance on international students to cross-subsidise operating across undergraduate teaching and research activity. And that has an impact on particularly about the competitive disadvantage that Scotland has when it comes to large consortia grants. Many of the sources of funding at the moment are looking at big science and big teams, and where there's a requirement for matched funding, that puts Scotland at a disadvantage. And Scotland has had a declining share of UKRI funding over the last few years.
Could you just explain a little bit to the committee what the difficulties with the match funding is, just so we understand fully what the problem is here?
Yes, very often when certain research calls will offer up grants of X amount, but there's a requirement for the universities either to match that funding or to make up the difference between the value of the grant and the full economic cost of conducting the grant. So very few funding sources give 100% of full economic costs. Okay. Charities give very little, sometimes none, but very little. Other sources of funding have differing levels of full economic costing. So if it's a matched funding situation, or the universities or institutes have to help to co-invest, that does put us at a disadvantage.
You understand that?
It will also happen for other UK universities and organisations as well. It's not a specific Scottish issue.